It's interesting just kind of reading through these, because having read the book now, I can sort of trace the logic of your argument through just the chapter headings, which is kind of nice. So I wonder if we can start with sex must be taken seriously. I guess when I first read that chapter, it reminded me of a thing that I was thinking and saying in conversations at university, when like all my female friends would have identified as intersectional feminists. This was sort of 2014, 2015 era. And there was a lot of stuff going on that, feminism, or sort of white feminism, is bad because it doesn't take into account like race and class. And the trans debate hadn't quite caught on back in 2014. But now I'm sure intersectional feminists would include the trans stuff as part of that thing. But putting all that aside, the way I was thinking about sort of sex from a, I guess, ethical, moral, philosophical standpoint was the phrase, having sex should be just the same as playing squash with someone. You wouldn't bat an eyelid if you're playing squash with someone. As long as both parties are consenting and it's mutual, then hey, anything goes. Why are we all making a big fuss about the sex thing? Religion is a little bit backwards because, like, come on guys, sex is just like playing squash. And your first chapter, Sex Must Be Taken Seriously, you talk about this idea of sexual disenchantment. And I wonder, like, what's going on there?
So I've borrowed the sexual disenchantment phrase from an American writer called Aaron Sabarium, who borrowed it from Max Weber, who described the process of disenchantment during the Enlightenment, whereby people used to believe that nature was filled with, spirits, agency, and then post-scientific revolution, we come to believe that actually it's all just kind of scientific forces, and there's no specialness, there's no sacredness. It's just kind of like blunt physical forces kind of clashing together. And sexual disenchantment is sort of the same thing. It comes out of the 1960s, and it's the idea that sex used to have a sacred status. I mean, in all religious traditions, pretty much, sex has some sort of special significance. There's some ritual associated with it. In Christian tradition, sex has to take place within marriage, which is a sacrament. And then that all falls away. And now the idea is exactly as you say, that sex it can have special meaning if people want to give it special meaning, power to them. But in the bare bones, it really is just like playing squash with someone, shaking someone's hand, making coffee, whatever kind of neutral social interaction you want to describe. I think there are two problems with the sexual disenchantment idea. The first is that it's nonsense. No one actually behaves as if that were true. Right? Like, people don't care if their partners go and play squash with someone else. People care deeply if their partners have sex with someone else. And even when they're trying really hard not to feel that way, it's a very common occurrence in the polyamorous community or, any like poly platform you want to go to online. You'll find people who are desperately struggling with jealousy.
So this is even when it's not just a case of breaking the contract of the marriage,
exactly.
Which is easy defense. Yeah,
exactly. It's not that your partner is being deceitful or anything like that. It's just that you have this deep visceral response to your partner having sex with someone else in a way that, of course, you would not have to any of these other kind of neutral.
So in my relationship contract, if I happen to have a clause saying that, we're only going to play squash with one another, and then my girlfriend plays squash with someone else, the fact that yes, it's a breaking of the contract, like, I wouldn't feel as bad about it. It's a
peculiar stipulation, but it clearly has a different kind of emotional resonance, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, people don't behave as if sexual disenchantment was true. Similarly, if your boss asks you to do something that's not in your job description, right? If you're asked to, I don't know, make them coffee as the example I give in the book, or you're asked to do overtime, or you're asked to do, something that's not like strictly listed within your duties, fine, that's normal. Like, I think we've all had experiences like that. If your boss asks you to give him a blowjob, that's completely different. Everyone knows that's completely different. And the feminists who are loudest in insisting that sex can be just like playing squash are the first to say that, of course, your boss shouldn't be asking you to give him a blowjob, right? Because we know that actually this isn't like a neutral. There is something special. We might not want to use the word sacred, but there is something special about sex, which means that people just have a wholly different emotional response to it.
So on that front, if we compare like a boss asking you to work overtime versus boss asking you to give him a blowjob, clearly those things are very, very, very different.
Yeah.
What would the Steelman feminist say in this situation if they weren't trying to use sacredness and specialness of sex as a reason as to why this feels different?
So they might say that there's a kind of imbalance between men and women, which means that there's a power dynamic at play, which makes that request more kind of charged than it would be, than some other interaction would be. I guess they might compare it to something like the imbalance between someone who's rich and someone's poor, the sort of inherent tension based on that power differential. You can't really apply that to two men. If a male boss asks his male junior employee to give him a blowjob, that's also really bad.
Yeah. Okay. So what would
I think that falls apart on that basis. I think the problem is just that it's very difficult to rationalize. It's not something you can kind of easily line up in a logical argument. But the fact is, people feel differently about sex than they do about other things. Yeah. And as far as we can tell, people have always felt that way. And that's just like a component of human life that we have to reckon with. And I think the problem with trying to explain it away and say, oh, well, this, whatever, people have these deep visceral feelings, but they are somehow wrong to, is that I think that down the line, that's really bad for women. I mean, I think it's bad for everyone, but I think it's particularly bad for women because if you don't think that sex has a special status, it's very hard to explain why rape would have a special status. Why would it have a special status aside from theft, or some other kind of neutral?
Yeah. I mean, you might say that it's more like violating of bodily autonomy than something like theft is. But I guess if you were then to compare it to, I don't know, getting stabbed or something, like it just. So when you first said the blowjob thing on Chris Williamson's podcast, so he's a friend of mine. I found myself trying to run circles around my own brain to figure out, like, there's got to be a reason why this thing is bad, other than saying, oh, because sex is just special. Like, because that feels like such an obvious answer, but also feels like the answer that I'm almost loath to concede that point that, like, surely there must be like power dynamics. Oh, but
I think I think because it runs very counter to the liberal paradigm, which is all about rationalizing human behavior. It's often been observed that radical feminists, so that's feminists who come out of the second wave and tend to have this kind of Marxist analysis of the relationships between men and women, reach many of the same conclusions as Catholics and some other religious groups too, but Catholics in particular. In Catholics, they oppose prostitution, porn, surrogacy, whatever you want to pick. Like they are often in agreement, although not entirely, with radical feminists. And I've often heard academics and other analysts asking why that would be, like why would radical feminists have anything in common with Catholics? And it's often used against radical feminists as well as kind of a suggestion that they're somehow like secretly really conservative. I think the reason that they reach the same conclusion actually is not because they are unusual, it's because the liberal secular alternative is unusual, in that they recognize the specialness of sex. They agree that for whatever reason, people have this very, very strong instinct to view sex as special, in the same way that we have a very strong instinct to like love our children or any other manner of slightly strange, irrational response, right? Yeah. It's just a given. This is just how people feel. And I think if you start with that prior, then you are going to end up, particularly if you're really concerned about the well-being of women and of children, you're going to end up opposing things like porn. And I think the reason that people's attempts to deny the specialness of sex, why they end up being much more permissive, it comes from that prior. But I think the prior is a problem, and I think also that people are really inconsistent on it. People will say simultaneously that whatever, sex is like playing squash, but then they won't behave as if that's the case.
Yeah. One of the other interesting examples that you talk about in the book is this situation, and I hadn't come across this before, so it just really sort of threw me for one when you posed it in the book. This idea of essentially sexual favors in return for rent. Yeah. What's the story here?
It had some media attention during the pandemic because it became landlords started doing it more. It's basically the problem when landlords will advertise, often surreptitiously, that they'll offer free or reduced rent in exchange for sexual favors from young, attractive tenants, right? And I don't think I've ever come across anyone who thinks that's fine.
Yeah.
Aside from the like handful of landlords who might propose it themselves, like all political parties in the UK are unanimous.
It's just like so terrible. Obviously a terrible thing,
right? Yes, but then I think it's very striking that, say, the Liberal Democrats are really opposed to the sex for rent, and there's been various calls to have like bespoke offences criminalising the advertising of it. But they want to decriminalise the sex industry. And Jeremy Corbyn, similarly, was opposed to sex for rent, but also has said on the record that he thinks that decriminalising sex work would be the more civilised option. That was the expression he used. I'm like, lads, this is the same thing. You're just exchanging one form of economic good for another. If you want to say that a tenant is far too vulnerable to be exchanging sex in exchange for housing, or if you want to say that there is just something grubby and exploitative and sexist and whatever about even proposing this as an arrangement, how can you possibly say that it's fine as long as it's cash? It just doesn't make sense to me.
Cash can be exchanged for rent, so it's like literally just removing an intermediary.
Exactly.
But clearly something about it feels really, really bad.
I think it's because it highlights what's going on. I think it's because I think that we've been sold a bit of a fantasy about what the sex industry looks like. A lot of people don't have any contact with the sex industry. They've probably never knowingly spoken to... They will have spoken to sex buyers in their lives because there are enough of them around, but probably they wouldn't know about it. And they probably won't have spoken to people in prostitution. So a lot of what we think about the sex industry comes from fiction. Things like Diary of a Call Girl would be a very typical portrayal of the sex industry, and a very unrepresentative one. It's not to say that there aren't examples of high-class call girls who have unusual experiences of the industry, but it's absolutely not the norm. I think part of the reason I take a different view from the standard view of the sex industry is because of actually speaking to women who've been in it at the grim end, right? Not at the high end, at the worst end, where actually most of the women are to be found, right? So I think that's part of the reason why people tend to have a slightly more permissive rhetorical stance on it. Whereas I think with sex for rent, it's just so obvious what's going on, particularly in the middle of a housing crisis, is that people are desperate, and you can so easily imagine how someone could be coerced into that kind of really exploitative and dangerous situation. I also do wonder a bit, like a lot of the reporting on sex for rent is about university cities and about the possibility of students being trapped in this kind of arrangement, because we know, of course, that students don't have very much money. And I can't help but think that part of what's going on there is class as well. I think there's that feeling that the women who end up actually in like normal prostitution are poor almost always, right? And it doesn't feel as if like it's something that could realistically happen to middle class women, whereas a landlord making a sleazy request of you does feel like it could happen to middle class women. So I can't help but think that there's an element of like self-interest there.
Yeah.
That's just me being cynical, but there we are.